I had the opportunity to go and watch on replay the Jack Tame interview with a chap by the name of Sean Hendy, spelt wrong, Shaun. Don't know why his parents spelled him that way, but they did. And Sean Hendy was one of the five horsemen of the apocalypse. I always thought there were four horsemen of the apocalypse during COVID. There was Cinder, there was Susie Wiles, there was the chap from what's his name? Josh, the Ministry of Health. They gave him a
Bloomfield.
knighthood. Sorry,
Bloomfield. Ashley Bloomfield.
Bloomfield. That's right. And then there was Chris Hipkins. But really, Chris Hipkins came in late because he took over from Jacinda Ardern when she tired of doing her daily stand-ups, and he then became the Minister for COVID Response, if you remember. But the fourth horseman, or the fourth original horseman of the apocalypse, if you like, was Sean Cameron Hendy. And Hendy came from, I think, Auckland University. And he was the person responsible for modelling COVID. Remember that, Josh? So there was Sean Hendy. Susie Wiles became the sort of unofficial publicist for the COVID response. Then, of course, there was the Prime Minister, and then there was Bloomfield. So the four horsemen of the apocalypse, all right? And there they were on a daily basis recounting New Zealand. And Sean Hendy, is he professor or doctor? I think he's doctor, Sean Hendy. He's got a PhD from the University of Alberta on physics. I'll come to that in a second. In fact, his PhD thesis was cosmic strings and black hole spacetimes, which, Josh, to be perfectly honest with you, a PhD on cosmic strings and black hole spacetimes is, I would have thought, the perfect, is it not? The absolutely perfect prerequisite to become the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, or to lead the COVID public health response in concert with others of his ilk. Anyhow, Jack Tame sat down with him because he's written a book. Yes, did you know that? He's written a book. And I don't know what the book is about, but I presumed from, and I didn't see a cover of it or anything like that, but I presumed that he has been written that book talking about the response and his personal odyssey during the time of the COVID response. Now, the reason I'm addressing this morning is not only because Jack Tame interviewed him yesterday, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but I think last night, from memory, was the cut-off date for submissions, public submissions to the COVID inquiry number 2. Now, when we're having part 2, we're actually getting into the important stuff. Remember, the part 1 was set up, and that was meant to ignore all the important stuff. Part 2 is to get into the what really happened, why, when, and how, and was the response the best response that could have been, all things considered, and with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, blah, blah, blah. But it's also about people's personal responses. And I have to say, an increasingly frenetic attempt by Voices for Freedom founders last week to remind people to put in their individual submissions to COVID inquiry number 2. And when I say frenetic, it had the air of desperation about it. It's almost like Voices for Freedom, and what's the radio show they have? Reality Check Radio. And I'm not being nasty here, but it's almost like they're running out of a cause, and they know they are. And they've got to keep the anger, the resentment, the upset of the COVID issue alive to still breathe meaning into both the organisation of Voices for Freedom and into, I guess, their radio equivalent, Reality Check Radio, as well. Listen, it's a democracy, freedom of speech, ideas, all those things are good things, but it just struck me last week, and I'm not being nasty here, there was an area, I got, for example, I think 3 emails a day, Josh, urging me, as because I'm on their on their email list, to put in my personal submission to the COVID inquiry number 2, and giving me a whole series of bullet points that I should talk about.
Yeah, I've had a couple come through as well.
See, and you're going, wait on, And it's almost like the organisers of Voices for Freedom have decided we're starting to lose our reason for being. And of course you are. I mean, it's like the Second World War. 5 years or 3 years after the Second World War, no one was really interested in the war, thanks very much. They were interested in 1948 and getting on with life, putting that in the rear vision mirror. We hope we've learned some lessons and dealing with today and planning for tomorrow. You know what I mean? It's not that you shouldn't learn lessons, and that is why the Royal Commission Part 2 on the COVID inquiry is going to be so important. But I think if we carry on living in the past, it's not that we're condemned to repeat it. We must learn the lessons of the past. But if we continually try and muster the anger of the past to justify our today, we're back to Treaty of Waitangi stuff again, aren't we? We've just created a new Te Treaty of Waitangi and its response to the COVID inquiry. I understand, listen, that people got upset. My grandfather, for example, would never buy a Japanese car. Never buy a Japanese car because he'd lived through the Second World War and he regarded the Japanese as cruel. And even though they might have changed their constitution and got back and become a friend of the West, he'd have nothing to do with anything Japanese. And there were countless, thousands, possibly tens of thousands of New Zealanders who felt exactly the same way. They never really got over it, but eventually we do. But having said that, on the correlative side, or the other side of that, was this interview on Television New Zealand on Sunday with the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, Sean Hendy. Now, Sean Hendy is or was regarded and his modelling as absolutely critical to the COVID response and the reasons why we went into shutdown and went into shutdown so long and so often and repeatedly in the case of Auckland. And it, for some strange reason, never properly explained to me, the department or the Ministry of Health and Bloomfield decided that Sean Hendy was the go-to guy and his team when it came to looking like what this pandemic might look like in New Zealand. The fascinating, for those of you who watched the interview with Jack Tame, I'm not going to urge you to do so because I'm going to summarise it so you don't need to. But it was fascinating that Jack Tame was smart enough at least to ask some decent questions. And I'm going to give him some credit for doing, or at least his research, for doing a bit of research yesterday, and putting a series of things before Dr. Sean Hendy as to how he got it so wrong. And this was the fascinating part, that Tame wasn't, as I might have been, a little more assertive and aggressive in his questioning. He just simply read back to Sean Hendy and his modelling exercise how they'd got it wrong so frequently and so often in predicting what they thought was going to be the zombie apocalypse. And in fact, he raised immediately, he said, well, you talked about a worst case scenario of 80,000 deaths, for example, from COVID. Well, we tried our best, was the response of Hendy, under a lot of time pressure. Yeah, but you were wrong. And having said that, the Ministry of Health and the New Zealand government under Jacinda Ardern actually based a lot of their responses upon modelling that they trusted from Hendy and his Te Punahia Matatini Centre of Research Excellence in Complex Systems and Data Analytics. So they actually rendered this control to this guy. And he came up with some crazy stuff, really crazy stuff. But then that wasn't the crazy stuff that struck me about this particular interview with Dr. Sean Hendy on Jack Tame's question and answer. It was this. Tame asked him a very simple question about, yeah, but the people who were dying, so there were two things. The people who were dying were mostly elderly people over the age of 60, 65, most of whom had comorbidities. In other words, they were really unwell anyhow, and this was just sort of finishing them off. Did you really need a response in which you shut down the whole country? You sought to vaccinate everybody. You mandated people who had some sort of objection to it. Created entirely second-class citizens, screwed up education in this country, stuffed the economy, and we're still going to be living with the consequence of the financial and fiscal borrowing for decades to come. What he was basically looking for is, listen, don't you actually understand? Because we all now, and this is Jack Tame, mainstream media, Television New Zealand, publicly funded left liberal woke shop, actually pointing out in 2025, a little late, but at least they've got there in April 2025. Listen, we got it wrong, didn't we? Essentially was Tame's line of questioning. And at no point did Hendy, in anything that was said in this particular interview, concede at all that their expectations and their modelling and their worst case scenario wasn't a live, viable proposition. And if there was any question mark about it, well, we come back to the standard stock reply of Hendy and his ilk. We tried our best under a lot of time pressure. Well, whoop-de-doo. You still got it wrong, and a whole series of other people around the world knew you were getting it wrong. Because, and I'll tell you who knew most who was getting it wrong. Here we go. I know this is going to shock you. Who knew that Dr. Sean Hendy and all the public health officials in New Zealand and all of the government ministers who were shutting down and mandating New Zealand were wrong? Here's the answer to that question. My 16-year-old daughter and all her peer group, who within weeks had worked out that they were not dying and they weren't going to. The old people, like her grandfather in his late 80s, 90s, was at risk, but they were not. Fit, healthy, young person were not going to die of COVID any more than they were going to die of the flu. And of course, you're always going to get the rare exceptional one or two. I mean, the astounding thing is that anecdotally, by April, May of 2020, the people who actually quickly most discerned that they weren't going to die and there was no danger to them were the young of this country. Oh, and presumably the anti-vaxxers as well. Yes, give them a tick. They said, no, this is all bollocks and I'm not going to put themselves. I don't know how they got there, but they did. But they did. But they did. All right? And here is Hendy 5 years later on question and answer, given an MBE, for God's sake, for his services to the COVID bloody response, saying, listen, our modelling was right, essentially. And if we made any errors, it was because, quote unquote, we tried our best under a lot of time pressure. He then said something that I think condemns him. At that point, Tame started to say, yes, but, did you really need to do all this, considering that even if good, healthy people got COVID, they weren't likely to die? And his answer was this. And essentially Tame was arguing, listen, why didn't you just round up the elderly, essentially, the ones with the comorbidities, the kids that, like my youngest daughter when she was young and she had cancer, so her immunology was stuffed, go round up those people and go and vaccinate them and look after them. Isolate them, for God's sake. Do whatever you got to do to save them. That's all cool. But let everybody else get on because it's not going to be a problem. And the answer to this was, well, you're measuring lives the wrong way, said Hendy in the interview to Jack Tame. And this is the part that scared the bejesus out of me and the crap. He then, as a justification for shutting down the entire country and Auckland on more than one occasion for weeks and months at a time, said this. Maori, now I quote you directly, have decades less life expectancy, this is in plural, presumably than anyone else resident in New Zealand. And he actually repeated that particular phrase on a number of occasions. It's actually factually wrong. average Maori life expectancy compared to average Pākehā life expectancy is 7 years less, not decades plural. But Hendy was still arguing that lie yesterday with Jack Tame. But then the aspect that he was really saying was, yes, we shut down New Zealand because we were trying to protect Maori and Pacific Islanders. Yes, again, who weren't, if they were young, fit and healthy, dying in large numbers either. They were if they were unhealthy and unfit and a whole series of comorbidities, but they weren't if they're young, fit and healthy. In fact, if they were a young male, they probably have more chance of dying or at least being adversely affected, and I hate to say it, by myocarditis and the original vaccine. And again, he then asserted yesterday, one of the problems, he said, in fact, it became the primary problem, is that Maori have decades, there's that word again, less life expectancy by Maori. By using quality of life, you're devaluing the lives of Maori people. And at that point, it all became clear that Sean Hendy wasn't about using science and statistics and everything. It was about using an ideology to frame the response to government, who then took him and Susie Wiles and a whole series of other wokes seriously enough to frame their response for all of New Zealand through essentially an ethnic or cultural lens. No surprise that Sean Hendy and Susie Wiles were the two leaders, if that's the proper sense of the word, of those who went after the Listener 7 in July 2021. You remember the Listener 7, including Professor Elizabeth Rata and a whole series of others who argued that Matauranga Māori or Maori indigenous science was incompatible with science, knowledge was incompatible with science. Well, Hendy and Wiles led the charge against them and suggested that some of those lot, in actual fact, should find themselves stripped of Royal Society status. And Henry and Wiles also claimed that mistrust in science was fueled by science's role in perpetuating scientific racism, colonialism, and injustice. This all goes back to 2021. See, there's an ideology. There's a zealot. There's somebody who's become a woke factional leader, not somebody that you can trust with science, with statistics, framing their advice and their judgment within an ideology and, unsurprisingly, getting it wrong. But that is the kind of person who still cannot see what they did was wrong, still can't see that they are ideologically motivated, still mischaracterize true facts. I mean, we want to talk about misinformation, disinformation. Go and listen to Sean Hendy yesterday, and still in 2025 refuses to say sorry for the carnage that they helped create, the damage that is ongoing and on-lasting, and for the futures that will be blighted, not by a virus from overseas, not by COVID, but by people like Hendy riding out with their public justifications. And God knows how this man got anywhere near public health. It was a revealing interview. It was an interview that makes you distrust not science, but some scientists, that makes us question forever whether their scientific lens is covered and clustered by their ideology. And I think that on the basis of that interview, you would have and might have seen yesterday, there can be no other conclusion. Not an apology amongst them. Those are my thoughts this morning. What are yours?